I'm Jane from Poppy Patchwork, and in today's video I'm going to show you some of my unfinished quilts. Before we get started, I just want to tell you about some of the books I've got for sale on Amazon. I've got my two quilt block notebooks for even-sized grids and odd-sized grids. And I've got my book, Let's Make a Quilt, showing you how to make your own 12-block sampler quilt, plus some other projects. Now let's get quilting and see those unfinished quilts. So one of the unfinished quilts is this jelly roll race quilt that I made with some nursery fabric. And it's the first one I've decided to finish because I am giving it to a colleague at work who is going to be a grandmother for the first time. And what I had to do to finish it was simply put the binding on. So I went to my stash and I found lots of kind of turquoisey fabrics, and I made a stripped binding which I have attached to this quilt. The next quilt top I found was this Christmas tree skirt quilt. I made it many years ago from a layer cake, and I must have joined the layer cake squares together and made them into quarter square triangles. And then I've chosen a red fabric as the setting triangles to make this, I think it's a hexagon shape. So I've done all the binding around the quilt apart from a small piece there at the end, and I must have just given up. Maybe Christmas had passed and I thought, well, that's it for another year. So all I have to do now is join the two ends of those binding pieces and finish attaching it to the top and then slip stitching it to the back. And then I will have this lovely Christmas tree skirt for Christmas this year. One of the first quilts I ever made was this Kaleidoscope Quilt, sometimes known as Stack and Whack. It's quite a complicated quilt for a beginner, but I didn't know any better, so I just did it anyway. All the blocks come from the same piece of fabric, and I've identified a particular pattern in that fabric, and I can't completely remember the process. But I think you cut a square of fabric out and laid it up 8 times, and then you cut it into 8 so that then it spins around if you join the pieces together, and it repeatedly spins around like that. Quite clever, but I never really finished quilting it. I can see that I've started to do some outline quilting on this, which I will finish doing, and then I'll decide what further quilting to do before I bind it. The next quilt I found is a more recent quilt that I made. This is a sampler quilt, and it has various levels of skill, starting with quite an easy 9-block quilt block in the bottom corner, but also includes some applique blocks, some blocks with some curved piecing, and the Dresden plate block. I've done some quilting on this quilt, mainly quilting the ditch around the blocks and along the sashing. So I'm going to continue to finish that, and then I'll decide what quilting I'm going to do within the blocks. I think my initial idea was I was going to do different quilting in the blocks to emphasize the patterns of the blocks, but I'm not sure I'm going to do that. It might just be a case that I want to get the quilt finished and bound, and then I can hang it. The next quilt I found was this Winnie the Pooh panel quilt. Again, this is a quilt that I started many years ago, and it would have been one of my first quilting conundrums. I'm not very confident in quilting even now, and I would have thought, gosh, what shall I do? So I think I've outlined Winnie and Tigger, and I've stitched along the tree, and I've stitched around the panels. I think I've probably done enough quilting on it to be secure, so all this needs is binding. I was going to give the quilt away, but my daughter says she really likes it and she'd love it for her first child. That's not coming anytime soon, I hope, but I will finish it and I will let her have it for her first child. The next unfinished quilt I found was this really huge disappearing 9-patch quilt. I think this must have been made with 2 Minnick & Simpson layer cakes, which I will have cut down into 5-inch squares before making up the 9 patches and then cutting these up to make the disappearing 9-patch pattern. I was hoping I hadn't really done that much quilting on it so that I could rip out what little I had done, but actually I've done more than I thought. I was hoping I could take it to the long arm quilter, but because I've done more than I thought, I'm going to just have to keep on quilting. I am quilting with diagonal lines across the quilt. It's going to be a really huge job to do, and I'll probably wait until I've moved into my new house and hopefully have a bigger sewing space. The next quilt I found was this rather busy sampler quilt. I've made it with Regent Street lawns, and I made it when I was teaching a class in my shop, and I used the Moda Sampler Spree quilt pattern, I think that's what it was called, and all the ladies and I used 1 layer cake of our choice to make these small 6-inch blocks, which were then placed on point with some setting squares, and then many flying geese formed the inner border. All that's left to do, because I took this to the long arm quilter to do the quilting, all that's left to do on this is to put the binding on and to put a hanging sleeve on the back. I have some of this Regent Street lawn fabric, but as we're moving house, a lot of the fabric I've got has gone into a lockup or a storage unit. So it'll be on my to-do list to complete once I move into my new house and I get some of my fabric back. I then came across some quilt tops, the Hungry Caterpillar quilt top, and then 2 baby quilts which I made with scraps of fabric. So I haven't gone to the expense of getting backing fabric or wadding for these until I know what I'm going to do with them. Probably gift them to somebody when they're expecting their child or grandchild. So I hope you've enjoyed this journey through some of my unfinished quilts. I know I've got more, they're in the storage unit at the moment, but this is certainly enough to be getting on with. I'll have to create a to-do list and keep them in mind so I don't forget that these need to be finished. Thanks for watching and happy quilting! I hope you've enjoyed these videos, and thank you very much for all your support by downloading my patterns and buying my books. Bye for now and happy quilting!